Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this video. This is an interview that's taking place with Dwayne. We're going to talk tonight about homelessness. He has experienced it himself in the past, and I'd like to gain some knowledge on this topic because it's something that hasn't affected me personally, but it has affected him personally. And later on, we're going to bring in some other people to discuss this topic, maybe to gain some more knowledge about it as well. Maybe some people on the server have also experienced it themselves. Um, so Dwayne, thanks so much for speaking with me. Can you just
Thanks very much
can
for
you
having me.
yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Um, oh, that's a tough one. How do you sum up a person? I think that the relevant bit, I guess, is the sort of 9 years that I was homeless for. So I became homeless at 15. It was just shortly before I was 16, in that just between taking my GCSE exams and getting my results, just due to family breakdown that was partly my fault, partly my parents, and it really doesn't matter whose fault it was. It was just a sort of thing. I'd had no experience of kind of the homeless system before that, for obviously, and I had no real experience of things like the benefit system and no real guide posting or anything that helped. I'm sure we'll go over some more sort of details of the time that I was actually homeless for, but these days I'm 31 and I have a house that I like and very little risk of becoming homeless again. I work as a platform engineer for the NHS these days.
Very good. Can you tell us some about, maybe before we get into more details about yourself, just maybe we can talk about some of the issues surrounding homelessness at the moment. Like, what are some of the common misconceptions surrounding homelessness?
Oh, there's a load of ones that because I don't want to just particularly talk about my own experience. Obviously, that's where my relevance comes from. But I've got a lot of people I've spoke to and a lot of stories I've kind of known. And the one that really comes up lots is that it's because of drugs. In my experience, the drugs usually come after the homelessness. If you become homeless, it's very easy to slip into drugs. I think I tried cannabis before I became homeless, but that was as close as I'd come to drugs compared to when you're in a shelter. There's drugs everywhere. Usually, the drugs are a way of coping with the situation. They're not what got you there. Another one is that people refuse help, and that means that they're not really homeless. And I've been told this, that I'm faking it because I won't go back to somebody's house and sleep on their sofa like they're offering. After all, you're homeless. Why won't you come and sleep on my sofa? Um, if it hasn't happened to you, stories of people that have taken these offers and ended up stabbed or robbed or raped, or for most homeless people I know, there's at least one or multiple of those have happened when they've accepted offers of help. You become mistrustful. Um, you don't really want to take offers that involve you being on your own and things like that. You feel safe because there's people around you rather than feeling safe because there's walls around you to keep you safe. Well, some people will think, well, it's more safe in a house than it is out here on the streets where anything could happen on the streets. It's completely flipped the other way around. Um, and one other one that's a really common misconception is, oh, he's got a smartphone or something like that. So he can't be homeless. Well, I was homeless from about what were the dates? Around 2005 to about 2014, during which time the smartphone revolution happened. And despite that, for most of that time, I had some kind of smart device. Even before smartphones came out, I had one of the phones that I could access the full web on, because that was kind of important if I didn't have access to to anything else. I'd obviously grown up in the sort of technological age of having the internet and things, and being able to access things on the web was a big difference. You can charge things in the library and things like that. There, I guess, the kind of misconceptions that I come across most. But the kind of case that or the cause that I'm trying to really push at the moment is about the Vagrancy Act, because
Can you
this,
tell us?
yeah,
Yeah, tell us about that.
yeah, this is one that few people know of, and those that know of it know why. No charity that works with homeless people supports keeping the act. There's been a campaign to get rid of it for so many years now. I think since 2018, it's been a really important case. Um, But the only reason it doesn't seem to be getting repealed is for lack of public consciousness, which is really why I contacted you and why I'm so thankful that you helped me get this message out. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 makes it illegal to be homeless in all sense. It does that in two ways. It makes it illegal to sleep in a public place, and it makes it illegal to gather alms, basically to beg for money. But it's not talking about begging for money in terms of, harassing people and being a public nuisance, which come under, more modern laws than an early 19th century law that was introduced to get rid of all of the influx of soldiers after the Napoleonic Wars who, came back with limbs missing and became destitute. That was essentially why this law was introduced. We have more modern laws to deal with problematic people if we want to these days. This act is used, for example, I used to sleep in a little alleyway. I could send you a picture. I actually found it on Street View the other day, so I could send you a link if you wanted, of the alleyway that I used to sleep in. And I used to sleep there because there was a street light, and I mentioned this to a few people recently. And I used to, read by that street light, and that was essentially why I was there. And if I got seen sitting there reading my book, then I would get moved because I looked homeless and somebody could come and give me money. So that was me sitting there trying to gather alms from people under the Vagrancy Act. Essentially, looking homeless is illegal and going to sleep is illegal. So if you try and sleep somewhere, you get moved. At first, it wasn't used all that much when I first became homeless, but it picked up quite quickly. And before long, most people know people. Most nights you get moved on by some police officer telling you to move.
Can I ask where would they move you to? Would they actually take you to a shelter, or would they just say get out of this area?
No, there's no signposting. There's not really places for them to send you to. Some of them don't really know the system, so they'll have a chat with you and try and advise you on places to go. But you know the system more than them, and you know that you've tried the places that they're advising, but they still need you to move on. There are, not all cops are bad, not all cops are good. There's good people and bad people in every job, and you've got the ones that would come by and kind of say, okay, you've got 10 minutes to move, or I'll have to arrest you under the Vagrancy Act, give you a wink and never come back. And you know full well that they were just letting you stay there, but they needed to tell you to move on. Some were a lot more problematic. There was ones that drove you out of town and then de-arrested you, leaving you with a day's walk back to wherever you were from, essentially, wherever you lived. Because you needed to be in the town centres, because that's where all the resources were. Otherwise, every time you needed to access anything, you would need to do long walks either way. It ends up making the police the enemy. It really does.
And who at the moment is attempting to repeal this act? Is it just charities that are campaigning against it, or are there also politicians?
There's a few politicians that have been doing a lot for it. There's I've got the names up there because I was remembering this one. So there's Alida Moran, who I apologise for getting the names wrong, but she's a Lib Dem MP that's introduced to her private members bill that would repeal it. It had its first reading back in early March or mid-March. And the reason the campaign's so important at the moment is because the government isn't quite... They seem like they're backing out of their earlier commitments to give it the time in Parliament to pass. And if the government doesn't decide to give it the time to have its second read, it doesn't matter if every MP would vote for it. It doesn't pass. And it's such a close stage, having passed its first reading, and given that there's very little opposition to actually repealing it, the only thing that seems to be holding it back is a lack of public awareness and the public just not being aware of it as being an issue.
So in that way, it's
not one more. Nikki Aiken, I should add her as well. She's a Tory. And my point there is that it's not a party political issue. There's the Labour Socialist MPs group. They've every Queen's Speech, alternative Queen's Speech they put out. They've called for the Vagrancy Act. It's not a party political issue. It goes across party bounds. It just needs that public consciousness, really.
So hopefully we can do that and help it along. Really, yes, because if there was some sort of political resistance to it, that's one thing. But if it's just general apathy, it's another thing.
That does seem to be the case, yeah.
Do you actually see it being repealed in the future? Or you're positive about that, yes?
Yeah, it's a matter of time in that it's been gathering speed since 2018, and as you say there, it's not that there's any opposition to getting rid of it. It's just that it's not a big enough issue for them to really give it the few days in Parliament that it might take to go through all of its readings and its stages and things. It should be a fairly easy bill to pass. There's no police powers that are taken away by getting rid of the Act. There's no real change that happens other than that the homeless people are allowed to go to sleep wherever they want without being harassed for it.
Something you were talking about earlier about how the sense of community is very important in the homeless community, in a sense that it's safer to stay out on the street with others than actually go to the home of someone who you don't know, obviously. How does homelessness affect men and women differently?
Well, this is where I have to, because there's a slightly dodgy ground in that most homeless people are male. And the reason for that is that women are prioritised by the council and given places. And a lot of people will backlash against this. And my response would be, honestly, would you really prefer that we were leaving the women out on the streets? Because they do have a much worse time of it. The women that I have known out on the streets are, by the time I've known most of them, rape is just a common thing. It's not a particularly, it's almost a horror that they've got used to. And so, yeah, no, women, children, people in the, struggling more need that help more. I'm not at all saying that I should have received more help than I did. Well, I am, but only because there should be more supply. The problem isn't in terms of that we should all have that I should have received more help than that. It's just that there should be more supply available to help people.
Could you, if you don't mind, could you tell us about some of the worst experiences you've experienced, worst events you've had while you were homeless?
I guess one of my worst ones, although it actually didn't end up that bad for me, is when I was kept as a slave. So essentially, my story from my side, all that happened is I was on the streets. I never begged. I could never actually beg, but I would sit in a public place and look homeless. And if people came and gave me money, yay, I needed that for food and things. So I wasn't going to necessarily feel bad about that, but I was never one of the people, I didn't have the confidence to be, can you give me money? So I'd basically just sit there and look homeless. And while I was doing that in Aylesbury sometime, a person came up to me and essentially offered me work. And I said, yes, sure. You're going to pay me some money and give me some food. Sure, I'll do whatever you want for you. And it was just gardening and stuff like that. And I stayed there for a few days and it just felt weird. They started not wanting me to leave the area that they'd driven me out to this area. Essentially, they were living in a couple of caravans and things like that. And they kept not wanting me to leave the area. They gave me very creepy vibes. And after about a week, I basically just ran. I left everything they gave me such creepy vibes. I left everything I had. Walked such a long way. It literally took me a few days, I think, to get back to anywhere I knew, just basically following the long signs. Found out about a year later that they'd been keeping people for years in cages. This has been a slow thing that they'd started by getting you doing the gardening outside and then controlling you more, and they've been keeping homeless people in cages. There are darker ones that I about me that I really struggle with, that I can't really
Sure, no,
do with that.
Sure, it's
okay. I was also very fortunate. Ultimately, I'm fortunate in that I am a white male. I certainly, homelessness leads in lots of ways. This might sound like I'm excusing myself, but does in a lot of ways lead to crime. Because you get to a stage where, what are they going to do? Lock me up and put me in a cell? So you're not necessarily, or at least I wasn't necessarily going out and committing crime, but I would also shoplift and things and not really care, because, again, what are they going to do? Put me in a cell and give me food? Crimes that I at least viewed as victimless. So there's plenty of times I ended up in front of courts, either for being drunk and disorderly, or doing drugs, or whatever it was back in those days. And I don't believe that if I hadn't been a relatively well-spoken white male, that I probably would have gone to jail at least one of the times that I was in front of a judge. And my life would have gone very different from there. So I am very lucky.
What are some of the ways people, homeless people, are assisted in the UK. So did you receive some sort of assistance, help from shelters or from or was it from in the sense from the state, or was it basically just from charity?
The state offers its own help in terms of benefits. That's essentially the state's help. If you're under 18 or if you're in a priority group. So when I was under 18, because obviously I was under 18 when I first became homeless, and they were very quick to put me in temporary accommodation, which is essentially very, very expensive accommodation, but the council's paying for it. So great. I was kicked out of the shelter that I was in pretty much the second I became 18. There was a group of us that were around the same age, and as soon as we became 18, they found an excuse to kick us all out. I am imagining that funding changes or something, but guesswork. So there are things like that for there. After that, it depends on the area and not a huge amount. Their response, at least back then, would have been that I could get housing benefits, but most places won't accept ESS, especially when you don't have any kind of deposit. You're clearly not working. There's plenty of reasons why they'll take somebody else over, somebody who's homeless. And obviously finding a job has its own problems in that you don't have an address. I've been fired before for being working. I was actually squatting in a place. So I actually was able to shower and things. I'd followed all the rules. I'd changed the water bills and the electric bills over to my name. It was an empty home and just literally wasn't being used by anyone. Somebody had actually given me the key, so I wasn't breaking and entering either, because that's the other rule. Somebody I worked with had found out that I was sleeping rough and had given me a key to a property that he knew to be empty. And I didn't ask questions. I used the property. But as soon as my workplace found out that I was homeless, I lost my job. So you can end up straight back. Sorry, to return a bit, I got a little bit off there, but things that are available. There are shelters. There's a few different types of shelters that I've been to in my experience. There's night shelters, which I went to a few nights and didn't go back. I just couldn't. I felt so much safer on the streets than I ever felt in there. It's a very kind of rough area. But it's one of the ones where you turn up at usually about 3 or 4 p.m. and they tell you whether there's a bed for you that night, and then you have to leave by 9 a.m. in the morning. And it's usually a centre that's open during the day, but the bedrooms aren't open. So the idea was that you'd only really get that bed for that night, and you might get a bed the next night. And I always thought that it wasn't worth if I'm going to be on the streets some nights anyway, I'd rather just be on the streets. There are shelters that are more stable. I went into a few. I've lived in 2 or 3. The main problem with them isn't that there's risk to them, because yes, there is, but ultimately living with people, especially some people that are going to have mental health and drug addiction problems, it's going to be a little bit more risky, but that kind of comes with it. And the problem with them is that you can't build a life from that. So I've said to a few people that what you need to escape homelessness is a platform that's stable for a long time. When I escaped homelessness, it took me 15 months of jumping in between weeks here and weeks there with agencies before I got stable work. So you need a fair amount of time to rebuild. And you can't do those from shelters, because either you're going to get moved fairly regularly anyway, but even if you don't, imagine the cost of rent of a property there. You're only paying for a failure room, so the rent isn't that high. But then think of the service charge, because they've got to have security 24/7. They've got to have counsellors and things, and these are supported housing. The idea is they're offering support and counselling and things like that. So there are, of course, lots of additional costs. And I think I worked out that I needed on minimum wage something to be working like 90 hours a week to pay the rent if I got a job in one of the places I was in. So the idea of finding a job, it doesn't work unless you've already got kind of the place to keep you stable. Most help is from charities. Charities are the only real help that's available. There are plenty of food banks and things that are doing their best with limited resources. But yeah, limited resources and a very, very, very stretched, very, very, very stretched.
We're seeing how numbers of people homeless is increasing over the last decade, really. Do you see the situation for people who are homeless getting better or getting worse? I know numbers are increasing, but is it for individuals getting better or worse, in your opinion?
It's getting worse, I believe. Now, I don't have a good. I've obviously not been homeless for about 7 years now. Hopefully, I'll never will be again. So I can't give a first-hand experience on that. And also, I live in a very different area now. I was homeless in the south, and these days I live up in Blyth in Northumberland. So it's a very different place to live in terms of the country. So I don't know. It was getting worse while I was homeless because the use of the Vagrancy Act was just rising and rising and rising and rising. From what I've seen of the figures of its actual use in terms of charges, while I was homeless was the peak, and it's actually fallen since. But I never trust that because I was never arrested under it. So not one of those charges would ever, not one of the things that I ever saw with it will ever show up on any record for it because I was never charged. I was just constantly moved. Those that have been charged have ended up facing, £100 fines. And of course, what do they do with those £100 fines? They're homeless and are begging for money. Well, are they going to stop begging for money because you've given them £100 fine? Eventually, when they can't pay it, it gets taken out of their money, their benefits money, which they were needing to survive. And they need to beg more. They're more desperate. I don't understand how people think that helps the situation. I just don't.
Yeah, you're fining people who don't have money in the first place,
Yeah.
and they're using whatever money they have just to survive. They're not wasting the money. They're not using it on things that are not necessary for them. Do you see? What would you like government to do if you could if you had influence over government? What would you like them to do to invest more in public services? Would it be better to repeal the Vagrancy Act? What would you like to see government do in the future to deal with this issue?
Repealing the Vagrancy Act is certainly a initial step, and it's a good thing that we should do right now. If we were going beyond that, then realistically what we need to is to have more council housing that's actually available for people. But that's obviously a problem that I think most people are aware of, is that we lack so much social housing, and that's what makes us limited to those who are most in need, which leaves people like me who aren't the most in need out in the worst conditions. If we were going as far as I would like us to do, I would like us to follow the Finnish system. Now in Finland, they have a homes first policy, which if somebody's homeless, you get them into a stable, full, permanent home first. They are usually able to continue doing drugs and things like that in that if they need to. It's not that they're given this on a condition of X, Y, and Z. They're given a home first, and we deal with the problems afterwards that led to them becoming homeless. That's not only a better policy for homeless people and not only helps homeless people more, it also saves money. It usually costs about, I think the figures say somewhere around £1,500 to rehabilitate a homeless person. It usually costs about £15,000 a year in extra costs keeping somebody on the streets. There's extra walk-in centres and extra medical expenses from somebody who is, living on the streets is not the most hygienic you can be. There's additional cost of temporary accommodation and things like that.
And also policing is a cost as well. You actually, if you take people, if you put them into regular housing, you don't need to have the same police resources where you arrest people, keep them in a cell, and provide services that way. Yes.
So I think they're the best government in terms of public finances, as well as, if you want to help homeless people, that's my reason. But if you want to do it just purely based on the finances, it's financially a better idea for the country. Yeah.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to bring in some other people. Maybe we can have moderate some questions for you. Thanks so much for taking those questions. We can have a few. We can open it up to the floor, so maybe the moderators can select some people, whoever's first in line.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
We have a question from FSM as a dog. Are we better giving money directly to the person or through charities, associations?
You're better off giving it directly to the person. Firstly, going by the studies, that the studies have shown me that people are better off if you give the money to them. They know what they need to spend that money on. So it does help more that way. It helps more directly. There's no extra costs that need to come out of it. It's directly going on what that person needs. The response that I usually get to that is, but they might spend it on drink and drugs. And as much as I love the old comedian's joke of, well, what do you think I was going to spend it on? In all seriousness, sometimes drink and drugs can, as hard as it might sound, can be the best thing for that person at that time. There were plenty of nights, for example, when I had a hobby, because I found myself in a hostel and became homeless again plenty of times. And the first night or few nights that I was homeless, one of the first things that I'd be doing was getting enough money to go buy a bottle of vodka that I could drink as much of the vodka as I could need and go to sleep, because it's not easy to sleep on the streets, and sometimes you need some help, especially the first few nights. It can be a challenge. In terms of everyday life, let's say I had £10. And that I've got food, I've fed myself, I've got a sleeping bag for that night, and I've got a book that I'm reading and I'm enjoying. There is nothing that £10 is going to do better for me than giving me a bit of weed that's going to mean that I'm going to sleep easier and enjoy the next few days a bit better. There is nothing else that you could spend that £10 on, unless you're going to, increase that to being a few £100 that I can use to maybe sort some part of my life out. There's not realistic amounts of money I'm going to get. Sometimes the drugs and alcohol can be a help. And I find it interesting as well, there's the Vietnam War. After people came back from the Vietnam War, it's commonly said that lots of the soldiers that were taking heroin over there managed to stop without withdrawal symptoms when they came back. It was relatively easy for them to stop the heroin. The drugs, as I kind of mentioned earlier, are part of the homelessness. If your life sucks so much that you're homeless, you quite often want to escape life. And yeah, sometimes that's what you need. In all honesty, I've had no problem now that I'm not homeless. I no longer do any special drugs or anything. I've not had a desire to touch anything like that in many years, and it comes from the homelessness.
Do we have another question?
Right, we have another question from Bogdan.
Hello. Sorry about that. So basically, I've always, I don't want to sound condescending, but as you, I'm talking from personal experience. I'm not native to the UK. As you know, most economic migrants from the EU live in shared houses that technically are made for 4 or 5 people, but sometimes they are even more. Now, my question is that while you are receiving benefits, right? Cannot 5, 6 homeless people band together and then rent a house, and then they can sort their life out together? So, for example, let's say your benefits are, I don't know, £600, and the rent is £600. But if 5 people share that rent, then it's around 200 quid each, and you can use the rest to sort out your life.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense, and it's a good one to look at. The problem is the cost of renting property these days. So this was in the south where it was even more expensive, but even up here in the north, I'd be looking at needing about £1,000 to move into a property for a deposit and a first month's rent. And this is assuming you found a very nice landlord who's willing to accept this as being a proposition that's going to happen. They're not going to ask for a guarantor you don't have, or 6 months in advance because you're not working, or any of the other things that I've heard asked for from even landlords that are willing to accept DSS. Let's say all of you are on job seekers allowance or incapacity benefit, which are not incapacity, what would it be these days? But they're all roughly the same amount you get. So they're, for an adult person, about £70. It would have been back, I remember it being about 50 minus whatever I had, but obviously it goes up over time. You need about £1,000 at your absolute best possible chance. You've got about, let's go by our best. Yes, go by, today you've got £70, and that's assuming you've never had a loan. You've never needed the job centre to give you a loan because you've got no food or anything. So because that comes straight out of it and everything. So you've got £70 a week. Maybe you could get enough people together to say that I've never been that social a person, so I tended to keep to myself. I didn't tend to like being around too many other people. I didn't really trust people, but it'd be a hard job when you've got to consider that being homeless is expensive. So if you're at home, you can get a fairly cheap meal. If you're out on the streets, you can't. There are cheaper places to eat, obviously, but there's also, if you wake up at 7 a.m. and you want to heat up and you want to go into McDonald's and get a coffee to heat yourself up, there's some money. There's also expenses that you don't think you need to constantly replace. And this is a strange one, and I'm slightly going off topic, but it's a kind of important one to do because it hasn't been mentioned about homelessness. Is this, people are cruel. You get used to losing all of your belongings when you're homeless because people are cruel. You would not believe the amount of times that I have woken up at 2 a.m. to find people who are drunk and obviously coming out of the pub urinating on me. And I do not know, like once or twice you'd think that's like, I'd still think that's insane. Why do you think of doing that? But that happens a lot and I still don't understand. And as a homeless person, you can't put those clothes and things in the wash. You don't have a washing machine. There might be a local centre that allow you to wash things, and you've got usually one day a week that they're open and you can get your things washed. Most of the time, I had to throw things away because if a sleeping bag's awful, then right, I'm begging hard today and I'm going to get a new sleeping bag. The benefits doesn't last the week. If you've got £70, that's £10 a day, which sounds like a lot of money. It does go quick when you're homeless. Money does tend to go quick. Yeah, maybe yeah. It would be hard. I'm sure people have done it. I'm not saying that it's an unrealistic possibility. It would just be very hard.
Yeah, I just want to say, just as you raised that, I was just thinking of, when you're living in a home, you can go to the supermarket, you can buy bread, you can buy whatever you need and put it in a fridge and it lasts for a week or 2 weeks or whatever. But if you're living in a tent, you can't do that. And then, as you said, it can be destroyed or stuff can be stolen. So you're not going to go out and buy a lot of things, even though you don't have the money. Even if you had the money.
Well, you also can't carry everything. I had a massive like a massive bag that I used to carry around, but that had a really thick warm coat because in the afternoon it's colder and things, a couple of different t-shirts and things I could shove on when one was too smelly and before I could get them washed, a couple of books that I was reading, maybe massive sleeping bag, which takes some pounding. You'd find me in the morning trying to pound my sleeping bag back into my bag. So you're carrying a lot with you. Somebody asked me once, why you don't keep it in a tent? And again, this comes back to people are cruel, is it'll get burnt.
Thanks for that. Can we go on to the next question?
Right. It wasn't a question. It was more of a comment from a wee Scots dog. If you're able to work a job while homeless, how on earth does an employer determine that they can't keep you on? It shows more application and effort than many could muster in such circumstances. How do they justify their prejudice?
They justified that one by telling me that they couldn't guarantee that I could stay hygienic. I obviously couldn't say I'm squatting in a property. So they only knew that I was homeless, and that their essential reason was that they didn't know whether I could maintain my hygiene in the office. How much of that was their real reason and whether they had any other reasons? But I was only an agency staff for the post office mail sorting. Is what it is.
Thanks for that. We have another question.
Yeah, this is from Virtual Feline. And you're on, Virtual Feline.
Oh, hello. So I was going to ask, is this in the UK, is this an issue of distribution here? Or is this an issue of true scarcity? Like, we have 11,000 homeless people here in the Seattle area, and there's 50 or 60,000 units of empty housing.
Yeah,
they can't afford. So I mean, like, I get. I mean, these people are like truly like sleeping like under bridges on the street.
Absolutely the same thing here. Absolutely,
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why I've always supported squatters' rights, is because if you found a property that's empty, you've lived there for as many months as you need to and publicly claimed it as yours, You have to have moved the electricity and water and things over because otherwise it's theft. You can't have broken in. There's a lot of rules around squatters' rights, but I always supported them because it reclaimed empty properties, and there's so many of them. But it's people can't afford them because of the cost, either the cost of living or the cost of property. Renting these days is insane, especially in the south of this country. But yeah, absolutely. Even with things like food. So I used to go skipping quite a bit, is what we call it, which is essentially nicking food out of bins. Not the kind of bins you see on the streets that you might throw in half your sandwich in that's going to be half rotten, but the food that the shop throws away at the end of the day. So at the end of each day, the shops will be throwing out a load of food that's used by dates.
Supermarket or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And it was nicking all of those until they caught us, started calling the police and put up extra cameras and started bleaching things.
No.
So we couldn't anymore.
Do you know the reason why they did that? Sorry to interrupt.
I heard a rumor. Somebody hopefully might manage to find out if this is true or not. I heard a rumor that somebody got essentially tried to sue a restaurant because they got, or I think it was the Sainsbury's in the room. I heard that because they'd got sick of some food that they'd stolen out of a skip, and it got deemed that it was the shop at fault. So they started bleaching things to prevent anyone getting ill and suing them. But that sounds very much like a rumor to me. But hey, might be true. I don't know. That was what I heard.
Okay, thanks for that question. We go on to the next one.
Yeah, that's from Era. What was your worst and best experience of people's treatment on the street?
The one I give for the best was the person that woke me up with a McDonald's. And the thing is, there's lots of people that did lots of things, and some of them were more than that person. I'd never spoke to them more than 5 minutes, and there was lovely people that came and spoke to me for ages. There were people that did more. But it was so nice. I was sleeping in this car park, and it had been a rotten day, and it had been peeing it down. And somebody come and woke me up in the morning with a Big Mac and just sort of said, "Hey, there you are," and walked off. And it was perfect. It was just the perfect start to a morning. The worst was the people urinating on me coming out of pubs. I've got to be honest. That was probably the worst one, because it just caused such a problem for the next week or so. It just meant that I had to try and replace all of the things that I was wearing, or try and find a way of getting them clean, which was very hard.
Has the stigma towards the homeless improved, do you think, or gotten worse?
I'm not sure. I think it's around stayed the same.
Where do you think it comes? Where do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from our embarrassment as children. We don't understand homelessness. We walk past a homeless person, we don't understand why we can't help. We've got rooms, like there's spare places that, like, we don't understand why there's other problems and things involved. I think as we get older, we just become more callous to that. And part of that's natural. You can't help everyone. You can even if you picked one homeless person and did your absolute best to help them, it's a bigger problem than we as individuals can fix. So we have to grow these calluses and kind of, I guess, learn to be cold to it. Learn to be, at least try and be indifferent to it. That is what I'm trying to break in a lot of ways, but it is, I guess, a natural cause. I think that we try and avoid seeing them because we slightly feel embarrassed that our society allows that to keep existing.
It's one of the issues that I always try to bring up on the live streams or when I talk to people is there's no justification for it. You know, we have the money, we have the resources. If we really wanted to spend them, we could eliminate, 99% of homelessness. I understand there's certain...
We did.
Yeah.
During COVID, we literally did for a little while, and then we kicked them all back out again.
So we could have done it. We can do it if we truly want to.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. Do we have another question? Can't hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I've got a question. We always got this thing about London being the the centre. It's a big homeless problem. I mean, most capital cities or big cities have the problem, and I understand why people flock there because of the opportunities and the job opportunities and things like that. But why do you think the government isn't doing anything to spread it around? If you know what I mean, if people are homeless. I mean, there's lots of empty buildings and there's lots of smaller towns and smaller places that people could be quite happy in. Homeless people, you know.
I think most homeless people end up feeling an attachment to a city because you have to be in a city to survive as a homeless person. That's not technically true. There's homeless people in smaller towns as well, but it's a lot easier to be homeless in a city, in at least my experience. And despite that, I'm sure that lots of people who are homeless, if you offered them, we've got this place we can put you in, it's a little bit outside the town, I'm sure that lots of people would jump at it. Lots of people literally would not care where you put them. But the reason why homeless people gravitate towards London is because that's where most homeless services are. It's the same for Oxford. Oxford is the one that I ended up in. And while I'd been homeless in lots of different towns, and I didn't go to Oxford because it had great homeless services, I ended up staying there the longest because I arrived in Oxford and the homeless services there were the best I'd been in any town. So I didn't feel any reason to leave and go anywhere else. I arrived in Oxford having never lived there before, but I became homeless at midnight from Portsmouth. And the longest bus I could find was going to Oxford. So I didn't want to be homeless in Portsmouth where I knew people. Yeah.
And we have a question from Era.
Yeah, I don't know if you kind of touched on it briefly with some of the other answers or some of the other questions, but I was wondering, what did you learn about human behavior on the streets? Because, obviously when you're sitting there and you're watching all these people walk by, what did you learn, I suppose, the most through your homelessness experience of other people?
I think I learned that most people are good people and nice people. But there are some really horrible people sometimes, I guess. But the vast majority of people are nice, even the ones that are ignoring you. As I say, I understand. You have to grow certain calluses in life. You can't feel for everyone that's going through a bad time because you'll spend all your time crying and never get on with life. So there are some absolutely lovely people that want to do their best to help, but they can't, and they feel bad about the fact that they as an individual can't, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault at all. It's us as a society. It's globally our fault. It is their fault in terms of being our fault, but there are some absolutely lovely people that just come and chat, and I think that it reinforced, at least my opinion, that most people are fundamentally good and nice people.
Thanks for that question. Do we have any more questions?
Yes, we have another question from Bogdan. Right, Bogdan. Bogdan.
You're muted, Bogdan.
Oh, sorry. I did unmute him. Bogdan, unmute yourself, please.
Okay, I was muted. So my question is, look, I'm always the person that looks for solutions. Not, I've hated all. I've been in rough situations. I've never been in homelessness, thank God, because my parents had an apartment that they owned. But I've been in rough situations where literally the only food in my house was like 2 slices of bread, right?
Yeah.
So I know how horrible it can be to go hungry for weeks at a time. But the thing is, do you think that if the government can, I don't know, issue like the £2,000 grant one time only, would that be enough to get you out of the situation? Or if they can act as a guarantor for a rent, or
For
what sort of
me,
thoughts?
lots of time, yeah. For me, lots of those things would have helped, but for lots of people, it wouldn't have. It's a very complex issue homelessness, that you get people like me that have my story, but my story is not the only story of homelessness. There's plenty of people that end up homeless because of abuse at home. They've had to flee partners that are domestically violent, and some have severe mental health problems. Well, I've got some mental health issues myself. I'm obviously not severely mentally ill in the same way as lots of homeless people are. There's lots of different types of it, and some people won't accept it. I kind of mentioned earlier that you become mistrustful, and lots of mentally ill people do, especially mentally ill people, because they get abused so often as homeless people. Homeless people in general are very easy to abuse because they can't really fight back or do anything. And a mentally ill homeless person is even more vulnerable for the exact same reason. They can do even less back to you. And they're much less likely to have somebody looking after them and helping them. In those cases, just throwing money at it isn't the case. We need to have better mental health services. That lots of them will refuse to go into services. I mentioned earlier about how we did essentially cure homelessness for a short period during the beginning of COVID. And while we did in London, at least I've only got the stats for there, about 90% of homeless people engaged with that service. There was 10% of people that even then, given all of the services that were temporarily available, refused them and still wanted to be out on the streets because they still felt safer there. That in those cases, just throwing money at it won't help. But I do think that going by the Homes First policy that Finland has of first securing the home and then supporting finding out the reasons for why you became homeless and helping with your other problems is the best and most cost-effective way of dealing with homelessness.
Okay, thanks for that question. Do you have another one?
Yeah, we'll bring you Era back in.
I'm just wondering, why do you think that the UK government doesn't have an approach of homelessness first policy? Because obviously homeless people have come from society, regardless what their circumstances for being homelessness are, they're still the fabric of society, and homelessness can happen to anyone at any stage of their lives. So I'm just wondering, why doesn't the government make that policy? Do you know the reasons? Have you ever been in meetings with councils to find out why they don't want to eliminate homelessness once and for all? Because it would be better for society overall.
I think it's seen as a radical idea, and I think that the idea that you I think most people view homelessness as a fault, that you've caused that fault in yourself, and that's why you're homeless and thus you're suffering. And if you make it too easy for homeless people, well, people will just go out and become homeless because they're going to get a house out of it. And if you were just, immediately throwing free houses at anyone that became homeless, then I guess you'd have a slight argument on that. But I'd still argue you're doing the best thing. But obviously, it's not that simple. The government has tried this, or at least they've been trialing in various areas. Even the Conservative government, who I would expect at least from, has certainly done trials of doing the Homes First policy, and where it's been tried, it's worked. But it's the same as all issues of homelessness. It just doesn't have enough of a public consciousness. Not enough people have first-hand experience of homelessness, and those that do rarely engage in politics, rarely get a say in politics. And so the issue isn't a particularly big political issue, so it rarely gets the time. So it's not that there's massive disagreements between the parties once again. It's more just that there's no real aspiration to move fast and address the issues, really, I guess. Partly because, I guess, from the Vagrancy Act, people don't see homeless people. It's been pushed, despite the rise that we've talked about earlier, the massive rise in homelessness. You still aren't seeing as many. Now, you are seeing more, at least from my experience. I've seen more homeless people recently than I have before. But still, lots of those people are pushed away. They're forced away as soon as they're found to be in a town centre, or as soon as they're found to be sleeping, they're pushed away. So they end up in more dangerous places, pushed down back alleyways and things like that, where they're more vulnerable. So yeah, the Vagrancy Act is also partly to blame for that. We don't care about it as much because we don't really see the rise in homelessness because they're pushed away.
Okay, thanks for that question. Do we have another one?
We do. We have one from Big Madge.
mute myself. Hey, you're right, Ben. I wanted to ask. Some people talk about, you know, how you mentioned the Housing First scheme.
Yeah,
They've done studies where they show that homelessness actually costs more than
yeah,
just giving someone a property because of like crime and other things. You can imagine, like, obviously you would know, you know, illnesses can spread really quickly. It's one of the
yeah.
reasons why homeless people were given housing. Um, do you think that they would do something like that in the UK? And how feasible is it just to start building more kind of one bedroom flats and things like that for homeless people?
Yeah, the thing is, it would cost money. It would take an initial investment, and while I completely agree with you, in the long term, it would save money. That's what at least the studies say, and that's I don't have any evidence that would go against, what the scientists are telling me. That it would save a lot of money in the long term. But initially, you've got to spend money buying homes for homeless people, and that just has a bad optic in it. At least according to our conservative politicians, I think that lots of them would say that there's just a bad optic to us buying homes for homeless people when there are so many people that can't that are struggling to buy their first home would essentially be the argument. And even if it was being done as not being granted but being given as a loan and needed to be paid back, it would still that's not how the media would portray it. We know that's not how the media would portray it, and of course that's what the government and politicians are more aware of than anything else. Would it work? Yes. Will they do it? I'd love to see them do it. There has been progress. There really has been progress, but there's the lack of political will.
Sorry to interrupt, do you see maybe it's necessary some major event when it would switch on in people's minds? We as a society need to do something. We need to unfortunately see some drastic situation where the general public, wake up to this problem.
Not in the near future, no. It's not something I envision. I don't think that it's likely to become a big issue unless there was a huge spike in homelessness. And I think that it would need to be huge enough that most people were directly affected by it, not that they became homeless, but they knew somebody that was. Until you get people's first-hand experience of it, I think there's too many people that think it's not a big enough issue for us to waste political time on. Especially at the moment, because let's be honest, there are a lot of other big political things going on. Maybe in a more quiet time, this would be easier to try and change. But as I said, we have been trying for many years.
Okay, thanks for that. Do we have another question?
We do. This is from Robert R. Did you find the standard of the homeless shelters across the city were the same, or were some better than others? And you mentioned that you did not feel safe in them. Given your experience, how do you think the shelter system might be improved?
For the latter one, that's a hard one. I'll have to sort of think about that. How could it actually be improved? I don't know. That they were very scary places sometimes. I remember one time there was a very, very drugged person trying to knife people, which was fun. But how you improve that is really hard. The staff there did everything they needed to do, but if you're going to have people that have drug dependencies, sometimes things are going to go wrong. It is a risk. They did everything they could. Nobody was hurt in that particular incident. But again, these are the places where those that are most troubled, I guess, go. Because the way that it usually works in most of the places that I was in is that it was essentially a staging process. You went to the most dangerous, the most rough one first, and you proved that you weren't a threat, you weren't a problem, that you could be more stable, and you'd essentially go to a more stable one after that. And that is, in a sense, what made those ones more safe, is that the people that had been there had shown that they were more likely to, not cause problems in the past. But I can't think of a way that you could realistically make those better. That's always going to be a problem that you've got with those kind of centres. The way to make them better, I guess, would be to not have those centres, would be for having people individually housed. Not necessarily that you need to have individual plots of land in each individual house. Certainly flats and things like that would work, but shared rooms were always a certain problem, especially when it was shared bedrooms where you didn't have a room to yourself. You had a room with 4 or 5 people in and some shared areas. But even when you had just shared areas, it could be problematic. You would get people that ended up locking themselves away in their bedroom because they were scared to leave their room. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Do you have another question?
Yes. How did you get out of the situation of homelessness, and how did you get your hands on warm food while being homeless?
Food was either by out of benefit money or by, as I say, I didn't exactly beg, but I would sit at the side of the road quite often and read a book or look homeless, because I looked homeless anyway. And occasionally that would result in people giving me money, which was very, very, very much appreciated every time it happened. The other time skipping, stealing food, or shoplifting. I'd quite often, if I'd running out of food, I had no problem going shoplifting. If I was at least hungry enough. Food wasn't actually that big a problem. In fact, one of the things that was always slightly annoying is the amount of people that would come and give you food, but they wouldn't ask if you want what you wanted or anything, and they give you something that you really weren't going to eat because you didn't like it. And you can't exactly. It's very awkward as a homeless person to go, no, I don't like that. So you'd take it knowing that you were going to put that in the bin and it was going to be wasted because you weren't actually needing food. And that was, I don't know, for me, it would be fish. I hate seafood. So give me seafood and I'm going to thankfully, much not, if somebody came and asked you, do you want a sausage roll or something? Yeah, that's much better. Ask me what I want. I'm not saying you have to give people money, although, as I mentioned, I think it's best. So yeah, sorry, I've rambled slightly there. I tend to go off topic a little bit. Feel free to poke at me and tell me to actually answer the question if I've gone off, and remind me what it was again.
Can we hear the question again? There was the second part about food, and the first part of the question was again, Glasgow?
How did you get yourself out of the situation of homelessness?
What I needed, and what I think most people need in that situation, is a long period of stability. 6 months of I might still be stable at the end of this 6 months doesn't really fix it. It took me, as I say, despite being fully stable, very, very, very stable in a house, which I escaped by somebody letting me stay at their house and eventually us renting a house together. But that's not the first time it happened. People had let me stay at theirs before. I'd been renting places privately before. I'd managed to get off the streets before. But it's very easy to get knocked back on. Your one benefit sanction, or if you're working for agencies, as I often was, a long period between jobs for that agency where you've got no real income coming in, or things like that can just throw you straight off again because you've got no savings and usually lots of debts. What happened eventually is once I got that stability, it took me 15 months to find a full-time job, rather than just agencies here and there, work over Christmas and things like that. 15 months to find a job that would take a chance on me, despite my CV having no history of work on it. And then since then, I don't think I've really been out of work other than in between jobs. But it did take a long time, and those 15 months were applying to so many jobs. It was just pure splatterboard. I applied to everything. In fact, the job I got was in call centers, despite me having social anxiety and thinking that call centers, that is not going to be the right job for me because I'm terrified and I hate speaking to people. As it happened, I ended up enjoying the job and quite liked it, but it was a job that I took because I was desperate, and it was I was scatterboarding my CV out to anyone who would possibly listen. It was not easy to get somebody to give me a chance, even then.
Thanks for sharing that. Do you have another question for Dwayne?
Yeah, we have one from a wee Scots dog. Right, Doug?
Sorry, I'd mute myself as well. I was curious about the aspect of when you're on the streets and whatever, how easy it is to, if at all possible, make friends from people who are either homeless or not homeless, or for that matter, actually maintain other friendships, or does that all just completely go? Are you just basically on your own, or?
It does depend on the person because everyone will be different. For me, I didn't want to, once I became homeless again, I didn't want to see anyone that I'd known while I was housed. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I left Portsmouth at 1 a.m. in the morning because I had to leave by midnight and I didn't want to be homeless in the town that I knew people. I didn't want to be sitting on the streets and bumping into people I'd worked with 6 months ago. That would have just felt awful. So I wanted to go somewhere completely new, and completely detach myself from everyone. And that's tended to be the way I did it. Did I make friends with other homeless people? Sometimes. But then sometimes, as one example, I had a couple of homeless friends in Aylesbury. I think this was when I was homeless in Aylesbury, that I'd gone out drinking with. And they stabbed me and left me for dead. I got found by some guy walking his dog at like 3 a.m. in the morning next to a river. I still don't quite know why that changed. As far as I've been aware, we'd been out drinking, and apparently there's CCTV of us kind of walking past the Tesco's at one stage, and then apparently they decided to beat the hell out of me. So apparently he was a lovely person when he'd been taking his medication, but he'd had a few days where he hadn't been taking it, and he'd kind of gone. But yeah, so I kept myself away from most people. Part of the experiences I had left me kind of avoiding most people if I could. I did have friends, certainly. There was usually from shelters. So, for example, in Aylesbury, actually, before that had happened, I'd been in the shelter and I'd made friends with somebody in one of those shelters, and he'd ended up going back and managing to stay with his parents. And his parents let me stay at his place for a little bit. There was quite a little while where I was essentially living in his bedroom. And I'm still in touch with him today. He's still one of my best friends. So yeah, you do still make friends. As I say, like I've stayed in touch with people, I've known them, but it's hard. You've got to kind of trust somebody, because it gets very hard to trust anyone. You know, ultimately that anyone will stab you in the back, because you know in your heart that you would probably stab them in the back as well, because everyone's desperate. That if it came to it, you probably would. It's hard. It really is hard sometimes. So yeah, it's hard to trust people.
No, I think it's a level of it's a completely different world than most people who have not experienced homelessness or are in any way connected to homelessness just have a completely struggle to understand. Okay, thanks for that question. Do we have another one?
Yeah, this is from me. How aware were your family, and how much support did you get of your family? And a second question is, did you ever experience, you know, councils are putting up these anti-homelessness, anti-rough sleeper measures, you know, in shop doorways and park benches, things like that. Did you have any experience of that?
Yeah, so with the family one, it's a touchy subject in a lot of ways, so I'll skirt around slightly. But yes, from my family's point of view, they would have said that they would have offered that support. From my point of view, I would have said that support wouldn't have worked and it would have quickly been revoked. But it's very difficult, and I try not to get into a problem. I have a good relationship with my parents these days, and I don't blame them for any of what happened. While I think they certainly had their faults through it, so did I, and lots of it was my own fault, and it's not a kind of a blame thing. I have a good relationship with them now, and I wouldn't want it to sound like they wouldn't have helped. They probably would have. I would have just said that me moving back in with them would have just led to a lot of stress, and then me being kicked out again shortly afterwards. But they would have said that at any time I could have come home. So there's two sides to every story.
About the measures, have you experienced the measures that are anti-homeless in different cities, like benches or whatever?
Yeah, they in Oxford they started installing the benches that you couldn't sleep on. Didn't bother me. I could just sleep on the street still. I started seeing some of them going up, but it didn't particularly bother me because there was always a million and one other places I could go. They couldn't put railings up everywhere. The one that got me was that they started putting up loads of leaflets telling people not to give money to homeless people, which always really annoyed me. Because we kind of needed that to survive lots of times. So it was, yeah, that was an annoying one that the Oxford Council did at the time. I don't understand why people think that getting rid of homeless people, well, yeah, of course I don't. I'm trying to hope the Vagrancy Act goes. I don't understand why people try and restrict the areas homeless people can go. You can't restrict them from going everywhere, and the streets are big.
Thanks for that question. Do we have any more questions?
Scott, a wee Scott's dog wanted to have follow-up. Who's it? Right, Doug.
All right. I was just curious because you said I was asking about friendships, and you mentioned that you'd run into a bunch of folk and you'd got on great, and then had a few beers or something, and then it had gone a bit badly when you got stabbed. I'm thinking, given your circumstance, whatever, I'm just really I'm just astonished by your positivity in terms of how on earth do you trust anyone after, but on the streets, on the let alone over people, you seem to have a very level attitude to such things, which is, I think, well, anyway, it's just amazing. I'm just curious about that.
Ultimately, life's been good to me. I did not deserve, for the life that I had in my early days, I didn't deserve to be in this place now where I have a beautiful daughter who I love and who loves me, a job that I enjoy, and can afford the things that I need. I never thought that I would quite reach this place, and a lot of me is still kind of sitting here giddy, going, "Hee hee! I've got the dream. I'm in a house. I managed to escape. I've got the job. I like my life now." So there's a certain amount of positivity that comes from that. But as I say, you do meet some absolutely lovely people on the streets. You do meet the best and the worst of people. There's some genuinely lovely people out there that are doing their best to help. So I've seen a lot of, the niceness in people as well, I guess.
Dwayne, you also said about how you were in contact with people who used to be homeless and now are no longer homeless. Are you still in contact with people who have remained homeless?
No. There's a few people the thing is, it's not something that you massively, it's often that you're dripping in and out of homelessness. It's rarely that somebody's actually, although I did spend a few times where I was homeless for a year or so, but it's usually that you're dipping in and out, you're managing to find a place here and there, but it's not something that you exactly go on Facebook and start shouting about. You tend to just not message as many people, and you certainly don't go, "Oh yeah, I'm homeless again." You tend to big up your life. You talk about how it's going well, about how things are improving from the last time you spoke, even if things aren't. Especially because I moved so far up the country, the places that I was homeless was down south, and obviously I live up in Northumberland, which is a very far distance away. So although I've got contacts with people down there, I don't know so much about them anymore.
Okay. Do we have another question?
We do. We have another one from Bogdan. If you unmute Bogdan.
Hello. Sorry, I've been asking a lot of questions tonight. Now,
Right.
I want to play a bit of devil advocate. I've heard you say earlier that people offered you food and you wouldn't prefer that type of food. But I'm of the mentality that beggars can be choosers, to be honest. And if that piece of food could have, even if you didn't like it, I've eaten food that I didn't like when I was hungry. And the question is that I know in my private experience, I've been working most of my adult life in a managerial capacity, let's put it this way. And I've offered homeless people before jobs because I could. And to be honest, only of the close to 100 people I did ask, only one person took the offer and actually made a life of himself. And the rest just straight up said no.
It doesn't actually surprise me. I think that some of those will be mistrustful. Some of those will have been through, they'll essentially see it as in the same way as we would see a get rich quick scheme, that they won't necessarily believe it happening. Some people just won't want that. They'll prefer their life being homeless. They won't want to escape it. They've got a level of comfort that they don't want their life to change because they're fearful of it getting worse, essentially. They're essentially stuck in the situation they are just because they're scared. There's plenty of reasons why people wouldn't. But this is what I was saying earlier when I said that I don't think just throwing money, for example, if you just decide to give everyone who's homeless enough money to buy a house, there will still be homeless people. That will solve some people. As I said earlier, it would have solved mine. That's all I would have needed, because I didn't have a severe enough mental health problems that that would have destabilized me once I was had some stability. But yeah, there's plenty of people that do need a lot more support and a lot more help than that. Just giving somebody a job immediately won't always help. If you don't know what you do, it obviously depends on the job as well. If you think that you're not going to do well at that job and you're going to get fired soon after, that might be a reason. I can't speak for obviously all these people. I'm just kind of guessing as to some of the reasons why they might have had. Yeah. What was the first part again? Sorry, I'm really bad at remembering the first part because I get wrapped up in the second part.
Basically, I was asking about you refusing food, which a bit
Oh,
ticked
yeah.
me off a bit, because I went hungry and I would have refused that sandwich, to be honest, even if it was fish.
No, and the thing is, if I hadn't eaten in 3 days, then I probably would have eaten that sandwich. But it was food was never the thing I was without. In all honesty, it was very rare that I would go a day without food. While I didn't eat much, you tend to eat sparingly, but it was rarely that I was starving and would. Because obviously, if I was starving, yes, I'll eat what was there. But I could always go skipping and things like that to get food that would be better that I'd want. My problem there is with so there's plenty of people with allergies that would be a more worse case than that. The things I usually would struggle with, the things, for example, I would beg for money for, were usually things like sleeping bags and clothings, or no, that was usually what like I was looking for extra money for whenever there was times where I needed more money than I had. And those were the main things. And to a certain degree, drugs as well. I'll certainly agree that was a certain part of my money that I needed to spend. And books. I spent a lot of money on books from charity shops. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to thank Dayne for coming on tonight. It's been really informative, and I hope what we can do is we can inform people about the Vagrancy Act and see about getting it repealed, and we can highlight this issue, because I think so many people have just so much of a disconnect from it that they have no understanding of what ordinary people are going through on the streets. So I want to say a huge thank you to Dayne for coming on and answering the questions, my questions and your questions. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can talk about this issue once again, maybe in the future when it's hopefully improved. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to you for like giving us the opportunity to air this really important issue.